Imagine a family that looks perfectly fine from the outside. No screaming matches, no name-calling, no dramatic blow-ups, just quiet. Maybe even peaceful. Dinners happen, bills get paid, and everyone goes about their day without obvious conflict. To an outsider, it might even seem ideal. But if you grew up in one of these families, you know that something felt deeply wrong, even if you could never quite put your finger on what it was. There was no warmth. No one really asked how you were doing and actually meant it. No one seemed genuinely curious about your inner world. The house was full of people, yet somehow felt completely empty. This is what psychologists and family researchers are beginning to call the zero-effort family. A family where the absence of hostility is mistaken for health, but underneath the surface something essential is missing entirely. So what does a zero-effort family actually look like up close? At its core, it is defined by a striking absence of parental interest. Parents in these families rarely ask about their children's day, their friendships, their fears, or their dreams. There are no regular check-ins, no genuine curiosity about who their child is becoming as a person. If you brought home a report card, it might get a glance and nothing more. If you had a hard day at school, nobody really noticed or asked. And it is not just the parent-child relationship that feels hollow. The entire family atmosphere lacks warmth. Siblings may coexist without truly knowing each other. Meals happen in silence or in front of screens. Birthdays pass with minimal acknowledgement. There is no cruelty, no shouting, just a quiet, persistent absence of care that slowly shapes everything about how you see yourself and the world around you. What makes growing up in a zero-effort family particularly disorienting is that the harm is invisible. There are no dramatic fights to point to, no clear moments of cruelty to explain your pain. Instead, there is just this quiet, persistent feeling that something is not quite right. You look around at your family, and everything seems fine on the outside, yet something inside you feels hollow and unsettled. And because you cannot name what is wrong, you start to question yourself. Maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you are asking for too much. Maybe this is just how families are. That self-doubt takes root early and quietly. Children are wired to make sense of their world, and when the emotional environment feels off but looks normal, they turn the confusion inward. Rather than questioning the family dynamic, they begin questioning their own perception, their own feelings, and ultimately their own worth. Think about the last real conversation you had with your family. Not just an exchange of words, but an actual conversation where someone asked how you were truly feeling and genuinely waited for the answer. In zero-effort families, that kind of exchange is almost non-existent. What you get instead are conversations about the weather, complaints about a neighbour, updates about some distant relative's drama, or commentary on what someone watched on television last night. These topics fill the silence without ever threatening to go anywhere meaningful. Nobody asks about your dreams, your fears, your struggles, or your inner world. Nobody shares their own either. There is an unspoken agreement that emotional depth is simply off the table. And the strange thing is, it can feel almost normal because it is all you have ever known. But underneath that surface chatter, a profound silence exists where real connection should be. This experience has a name, and it might resonate deeply with you. It is the feeling of being familiar strangers. You live under the same roof, share the same last name, sit at the same dinner table, and yet you have absolutely no real sense of who these people are on the inside. You do not know what your mother genuinely fears, what your father quietly dreams about, or what your sibling truly struggles with. And more painfully, they do not know those things about you either. Nobody ever asked. Nobody ever shared. There is a physical closeness that exists alongside a profound emotional distance. You can be surrounded by family and still feel completely alone in the most isolating way imaginable. This is not just an awkward family dynamic or a personality difference. This gap, this invisible wall between people who are supposed to be your closest relationships, points to something far more significant happening beneath the surface. What you have been experiencing actually has a name, and that name is emotional neglect. This is not simply an unfortunate family communication style or a personality quirk that some households happen to have. Emotional neglect is a recognized form of psychological harm, and it carries real, lasting consequences for the people who grow up inside it. The absence of effort is not neutral. When parents consistently fail to show up emotionally, when care is withheld, when your inner world is treated as unimportant or invisible, that absence leaves a mark. Society often focuses on what parents do wrong in obvious, visible ways. But emotional neglect is defined precisely by what does not happen. No warmth offered, no curiosity shown, no emotional investment made. And just because the harm is invisible does not mean it is any less real. Recognizing this is not about blame. It is about accuracy. Calling it what it is becomes the first step toward understanding why you feel the way you do. And this is where the real damage begins to take shape. When you grow up in a zero-effort family, you do not just miss out on warmth and connection. You absorb a deeply painful message about yourself. Children are not yet equipped to think, "My parents are emotionally unavailable." Instead, the mind of a child translates that absence into something far more personal. It becomes, "I am not worth their time. I am not interesting enough to ask about. I must not matter very much." That internalized message does not stay in childhood. It follows you. It shapes how you see yourself in friendships, in romantic relationships, in the workplace. You may find yourself constantly shrinking, over-apologizing, or feeling quietly undeserving of good things. That is not a personality trait you were born with. That is low self-worth, carefully constructed by years of being treated as though your inner world simply did not matter. Beyond low self-worth, growing up in a zero-effort family also plants the seeds of chronic anxiety. When your emotional needs are consistently ignored or unacknowledged, your nervous system never gets the chance to feel safe. As a child, you are constantly waiting for someone to notice how you feel, to ask if you are okay, to simply check in. But that moment rarely comes. Over time, your mind learns to exist in a permanent state of emotional alertness, always scanning for connection, always bracing for disappointment. This is not just occasional worry. This becomes a baseline way of moving through the world. As an adult, that unresolved uncertainty transforms into generalized anxiety, difficulty relaxing, and a persistent feeling that something is about to go wrong. The anxiety is not random. It is a direct echo of a childhood spent emotionally unsupported and emotionally unseen. And then there are the relationships outside the family. This is where so many people who grew up in zero-effort families feel the impact most painfully. You want closeness, you crave real connection, but something always seems to get in the way. You might pull back just when things start to feel intimate, or you might not even know how to let someone in because no one ever showed you what that looks like. When you grow up without a working blueprint for emotionally present, supportive relationships, you enter adulthood essentially trying to build something you have never seen before. You do not know how to ask for support, how to receive care without suspicion, or how to trust that someone will actually show up for you. It is not a character flaw, it is a gap, a missing foundation that was never laid during the years when it mattered most. Now, after sitting with all of that, it is important to pause and say something clearly. Healing is genuinely possible. The patterns left behind by a zero-effort family are not permanent sentences. They are learned responses, shaped by an environment that failed to give you what you needed. And what is learned can, with time and intention, be unlearned and replaced. But healing does not happen passively. It does not arrive simply because you are now aware of the problem. It requires deliberate, consistent steps taken in a new direction. So for the remainder of this discussion, we are going to focus on two specific strategies that can begin to shift these deeply rooted patterns. These are not quick fixes. They are foundational moves that create the conditions for real lasting change. The first is acceptance, and the second is learning to directly ask for your needs to be met. Let us start with acceptance. The first and most essential step in healing from a zero-effort family is acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of saying what happened was fine, but acceptance as in clearly acknowledging the reality of what you experienced. Before any genuine change can take root, you have to be honest with yourself about what your childhood actually looked like emotionally. And this is where many people get stuck. There is a powerful resistance that comes up when you start to examine your upbringing, especially when there was no shouting, no visible cruelty, nothing dramatic to point to. It becomes easy to dismiss your own experience, to tell yourself you are overreacting or being ungrateful. But that dismissal is exactly what keeps healing out of reach. Acceptance means stopping the cycle of minimizing your pain and finally allowing yourself to see the full picture of what shaped you. Now, here is something important to sit with. Emotional neglect is not a neutral experience. When the people who were supposed to love you most consistently failed to show up, ignored your pain, or brushed past your achievements without a second glance, that was not simply indifference, that was harmful. Some people hesitate to use the word abuse because there were no raised voices, no visible bruises. But harm does not require aggression to be real. When a child reaches out emotionally and is met with emptiness again and again, that absence leaves a mark. The message absorbed is that your inner world does not matter, that your feelings are inconvenient, that your wins are unremarkable. Over time, that message becomes a belief, and beliefs formed in childhood tend to run deep. Recognizing this as genuinely harmful is not about assigning blame. It is about being honest with yourself about what actually happened. Many people struggle to accept that their upbringing was damaging, especially when there was no hitting, screaming, or obvious cruelty. The internal dialogue often sounds like, "My parents kept a roof over my head, so I have nothing to complain about." This minimization is incredibly common, but it is also one of the most significant barriers to healing. When there is no dramatic story to point to, no visible bruises or explosive arguments, it becomes easy to dismiss your own pain as exaggerated or ungrateful. But emotional neglect does not require visible evidence to cause real harm. The absence of warmth, interest, and emotional investment is damaging precisely because it is invisible. And when you continuously minimize what happened, you stay stuck in confusion, unable to understand why you struggle, why relationships feel hard, or why you never quite feel like enough. Now, acceptance does not mean excusing what happened or pretending it was fine. It does not mean you have to forgive anyone on a timeline, cut people off, or suddenly feel at peace with painful memories. That is not what this is about. Acceptance in this context means clearly and honestly seeing the reality of what occurred. It means acknowledging that the emotional neglect was real, that it caused genuine harm, and that waiting for your family to suddenly become different will only keep you stuck in a cycle of disappointment. So many people spend years, sometimes decades, holding on to hope that things will change, that their parents will finally show up, that the family dynamic will shift, but that waiting prevents healing. When you accept what actually happened, you free yourself from that waiting. You stop measuring your worth against their inability to show up, and you finally create space to move forward. This is where acceptance becomes truly powerful. Once you stop minimizing what happened and clearly see that emotional neglect caused real damage, something important shifts. You stop asking yourself why relationships feel so exhausting, or why intimacy makes you want to pull away. You stop blaming yourself for struggles that were never your fault to begin with. Instead, you start understanding that you simply were never taught certain relational skills, things like expressing vulnerability, asking for support, or trusting that others will show up for you. And here is the key insight: skills that were never taught can absolutely be learned. Acceptance moves you out of confusion and into clarity. It transforms the question from "what is wrong with me" into "what do I still need to learn?" That is not a small shift. That is everything. Because from that place of clarity, real intentional growth becomes not just possible, but genuinely within reach. Now that we have talked about acceptance, let us move into the second healing step, and this one is genuinely challenging. It involves directly asking other people to meet your needs. That might sound simple on the surface, but for anyone who grew up in a zero-effort family, this can feel almost impossible. Think about what you were taught, not through words, but through experience. You learned that your needs were invisible. You learned that bringing them up changed nothing. Nobody asked how you were feeling. Nobody checked in. So over time, you stopped expecting anyone to show up for you. Asking for what you need requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires a belief that someone will actually respond. When that belief was never built in childhood, the very act of opening your mouth and saying what you need can feel deeply unnatural, even terrifying. So what does directly asking for your needs actually look like? Because for many people, it feels abstract or even impossible to imagine, but it can be surprisingly simple in practice. Instead of shutting down when anxiety hits, you say to someone you trust, "I am feeling really anxious right now. Can I have a hug?" Instead of sitting alone in emotional confusion, you reach out and say, I am not sure what I am feeling, but something feels off. Can we talk about it? Instead of pretending everything is fine, you say, I had a really hard day and I just need someone to listen. These are not dramatic declarations. They are small, honest moments of reaching toward another person. They feel uncomfortable at first, especially when you were never taught that your inner world was worth sharing. But they are exactly the kinds of phrases that begin to build real connection. So why does something as simple as asking for support feel so incredibly difficult, even terrifying? For people raised in zero-effort families, vulnerability was never safe. Every time you needed something emotionally and no one showed up, your developing mind recorded that experience. Over time, a deeply ingrained belief took root. People will not come through for you. Asking only leads to disappointment, and so to protect yourself from that pain, you stopped asking altogether. The silence felt safer than the rejection. This belief did not form because you were weak or overly sensitive. It formed because your environment consistently taught you that your emotional needs were invisible, unimportant, or simply too much. Vulnerability began to feel pointless, even dangerous. And now, as an adult, reaching out to others triggers that same old fear. The walls you built as a child were protective then, but today they are keeping connection out. The key is to start small and choose your practice partners wisely. You do not need to immediately open up to everyone in your life. Begin with one person who has shown you consistent kindness and reliability. Maybe it is a friend who checks in on you, a therapist, or a partner who has demonstrated patience. Share something small, notice how they respond, and let that experience slowly rewire your nervous system's expectations. Trust is built in layers, not all at once. And here is something important to hold on to. Asking for support and actually receiving it gracefully are both skills. Skills that require practice, repetition, and patience with yourself. Just because no one ever modeled this for you does not mean you are incapable of learning it. You are not broken. You are simply someone who missed out on early training that others received, and that training can absolutely begin right now. And so here we are at the end of this conversation, and I want to leave you with something important. Growing up in a zero-effort family was never a reflection of your worth. It was never about you being too much, too little, or somehow undeserving of love and attention. It was about the limitations of the people who were supposed to show up for you and they simply did not. That is their story, not yours. You are not broken. You are someone who grew up without the emotional tools you deserved, and that is a very different thing. With awareness, you can finally see the pattern clearly. With acceptance, you can stop waiting for a past that will never change. And with intentional practice, you can build the kind of emotionally rich, deeply connected relationships you always deserved. That journey starts now, and you are absolutely worth every step of it.